You know, there is certainly the justice has given us a wonderful view of what it's like on the street, up front, close and personal with this issue, as well as its historical perspective. But of course, we don't get to that, or we do get to that with wonderful background and studies done within the world of academia. So we're very fortunate to have here today with us Professor Alex Holsinger. Professor Holsinger is from the University of Missouri at Kansas City. He's been there for some 18 years now, and he and his colleagues out there, he has written and studied in the areas of community corrections, correctional rehabilitation and treatment, criminal justice in the popular media, and certainly in pretrial release and detention issues. So I would ask you to join me in an offering of warm welcome to Professor Holsinger to the podium. Thank you, Professor.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and be in this room with a group of folks who I believe have already done a lot of work in terms of setting a tone for reform in a lot of good directions. I also want to thank Justice Daniels for setting a really good stage and telling a story that is, I think, on the leading edge of a lot of other stories around the country in terms of what often is confronted when a body undertakes this type of reform and change. Back when I was at the University of Cincinnati in the 1990s, I had to, and I want to emphasize had to, take a class, a doctoral level class on management theory. And I don't remember a lot about it, except for there was only one exam only, and that was the only thing you were graded on at the end. So you just went to class and you listened, you practiced yawning with your mouth closed, and then without letting your professor know you were yawning. But I'm sure no one in this room can relate to that. But the only thing I remember from that class, in reality, is that systems are built to last. Systems are built to resist change. And a lot of what Justice Daniels was talking about, and a lot of what you all have seen, especially those of you that have had a direct hand in bail reform, in pretrial decision-making reform, have probably encountered a lot of those dynamics as they relate to systems. Systems are built to last. Systems are built to continue. And so I want to thank you, Justice Daniels, for highlighting a lot of the things that can and will happen as this type of reform continues. Most of my work, at least when I look at the last 25 years, most of my work has been in the area of post-dispositional research. Specifically, I was trained in program evaluation, and I've done a lot of work, and still do, in the area of treatment and rehabilitation, substance abuse treatment, cognitive behavioral interventions, things of that nature that are designed to help offenders reduce the likelihood of recidivism. Of course, this is long after conviction, long after they've been assigned to some type of sanction, whether it be a secure sanction in a facility or whether it be a community sanction out in the community. But about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in 2011, 2012. It was really when a lot of the momentum behind the pretrial reform that we're seeing spread across the country take hold. And so I was invited to generate some research looking at risk assessment, but this time, instead of risk assessment in the post-dispositional community, looking at risk assessment in the pretrial area. And that's how my involvement started as a researcher, and that really is what I am, although that doesn't stop me from being mistaken for an attorney. Many people think that I have a JD or that I know a lot about the law, especially my students who come and give me the whole, like, I'm just asking for a friend kind of, and because they're in some kind of trouble, and they're like, I need your advice, and they lay out the scenario, and I'm like, my advice is you need a lawyer. Before you go any further. So I'm in the area of research. I'm in the area of statistical analyses and information dissemination. And so my role and privilege has been to be involved in research in a number of different capacities. Probably most notably, I've done a lot of analyses in the area of pretrial decision making. And while Justice Daniels and many of the other speakers that you're going to hear today are going to talk about the things that you're confronting and the reasons for these decisions and the motivations and reasons behind these types of reforms, what I'm hoping to convey to you this morning is real specific information as to the reasons why. In other words, Justice Daniels, you use the term, common sense. A lot of these decisions and a lot of these reforms are no-brainers. And they are. They are, with one important caveat, and that is that people who are going to resist this and people that are part of the systems which are designed to resist change are going to want to see the evidence. They're going to want to see the reasons specifically. So I'm going to share some information with you today from a number of different studies. Probably the most notorious or notable study was one I had a part in that I did for the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, which is one of a dozen or 15 or maybe even a score of national level organizations, both private and public, both governmental and non-governmental, that are behind, that are really pushing pretrial reform right now. And that study dealt with what's referred to as the hidden costs of pretrial incarceration, and we looked at the whole rubric of pretrial incarceration and what specific effects that has, and the reasons behind those effects. In other words, so we have a very clear understanding on how that works in terms of what the reverberating effects are of pretrial detention. But that's a little bit down the road. Then later on, I was asked to replicate that study in a couple of different places because science, in many cases, demands replication. It's not uncommon to find results that are anomalous, results that are compelling, results that seem very important, but nonetheless, if those results exist in a vacuum, they lack credibility, or at least they don't stand up to time. And so I was asked to replicate some of the same sort of research in different locations around the country, including my home states, since I live on a state line or near a state line, my home states of Kansas and Missouri. And I've seen firsthand with the local jurisdictions and the states that I've worked with the kind of resistance that Justice Daniels mentioned as well from the bail industry. I wish I had some colorful story about finding a horse's head in my bed because of a report I had issued. I don't have stories quite that colorful, but I have seen a lot of people who are really angry at a lot of the stuff that I've had to say. People from the bail bonds, the private bail bonds industry, and they not at all happy about the recommendations that we've been making. So turning to some of the research here, recognizing the costs of pretrial detention, that's really what the bulk of what I had to share with you this morning in the time I have left is going to be. And then also I have some information as well at the end of my presentation about recognizing the value of risk assessment. Now, like Justice Daniels, I too read the report that the Sentencing Commission prepared and was released in February, and was very pleased to see all the changes, and really that report in general really could be a textbook, in a manner of speaking, in a class that I'm teaching as well, or at least parts of it, because it does such a great job of being very clear and very plain about definitions and terms and terminology and what it means, and some of the gray areas that exist in the terms that we use to refer to a lot of really important concepts. I was also, perhaps unsurprisingly, very interested in the risk assessment information that was contained in the report as well. And I would absolutely, I think, Alex, I'm going to ask if I can speak with you later on about seeing some of the original research that was done in the development of that risk assessment, because that's the existence and use of actuarial risk assessments is really absolutely critical to this reform. And I would actually even go so far as to say that I'm not certain that the true benefits of actuarial risk assessment can be realized as long as bail exists. as long as money bail, I should say, as long as money bail exists. Money bail, and you heard several examples shared by Justice Daniels this morning, money bail serves to disrupt actuarial risk assessment decision-making. And now, I've never worked with a jurisdiction that abolished bail. I've worked with jurisdictions that have taken steps to mitigate the effects of a money bail system. I have worked with jurisdictions to try to minimize the sway that the money bail system has. But as long as that money bail system is there, the negative effects that come from that stand a really good chance of remaining. So many of you have probably heard statements like this, that decisions made at the pretrial phase affect everything. Way back in the day when I first started teaching at UMKC, I taught huge sections of Criminal Justice 101. And my students would often ask me, what is the most important? We talk a lot about decision-making in criminal justice. And in fact, in many ways, our introductory to CJC class, CJC 101, you could really make it all about decision-making. Criminal justice is filled with dichotomies, right? And so I'm often asked, what is the most important dichotomy? What's the most important decision point in the criminal justice system? And I said, I don't like to narrow things down to one. But I certainly would have to focus on a police officer's decision to arrest or not is without question a really important decision. The prosecutor deciding to charge or not, or perhaps with more nuance, deciding what to charge with is without question one of the most important decision points in criminal justice, criminal case processing. I would also rank pretrial release, yay or nay, as having as much weight as perhaps those first two. But there is an increasing amount of literature that shows that it has shown and continues to show the importance of pretrial decision-making, particularly beginning with but not ending with the decision whether or not to detain someone in jail during that pretrial period. And we know from studies, empirical studies, large-scale empirical studies going all the way back to Rankin in 1960, which is often cited, and I believe this was cited in the Sentencing Commission's report here in Connecticut. We know that globally, when we look at things as a whole, that people who are detained pretrial, they're more likely to be convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced to jail and or prison versus a community sanction, and they're more likely to be sentenced to prison or jail longer than people who are not detained. However, some of those earliest studies were, by today's standards, rudimentary in the sense that they simply looked at things from a 10,000-foot view, and they didn't incorporate a really important aspect of empirical research today, and one that I'm going to share with you, and that is the issue of statistical control. In other words, those earliest studies didn't control for important things that could influence a judge's decision or a recommendation to detail. So, excuse me, I'm sorry, I do know how to work PowerPoint once in a while. When we look at some of the later research that came after Rankin in 1960, and there have been many studies throughout the 70s and 80s and into the 90s and today, similarly situated defendants whose only difference was whether or not they were detained in jail. So in other words, we controlled, these studies controlled for risk level, actuarial risk in some capacity. They controlled for the charge, the offense that the person has been charged with. We still see the same thing. Higher likelihood of conviction, higher likelihood of a secure disposition as opposed to community sanction, and a higher likelihood of longer sentences. And these early studies really set the stage for a lot of the studies that I'm going to, or the findings from a lot of the studies that I'm going to share with you today. Now, the most concern seems to be focused on low-risk individuals. Low-risk individuals. The effects of pretrial detention might be magnified for low-risk defendants. Well, I don't think I wouldn't get too much argument on that point, but again, it begs the question why. Specifically, what's going on inside that black box, as it were, compared to high-risk defendants. And to be very clear, and this is something that I share with the stakeholders and decision makers a lot. What we mean by low risk, we're talking about defendants who have been determined objectively to pose an actuarial low likelihood of failing to appear, or FTA, a low likelihood of NCA, which is commonly referred to as new criminal activity. And the most recent outcome variable that's being looked at, I would consider the research that looks at NVCA to be somewhat in its infancy, but it's with the availability of data, more and larger and better data sets, we're now in a position where we're able to look at predicting the likelihood of NVCA, or new violent criminal activity, because while certainly FTA is an extremely important outcome, and I would never dismiss it as an important outcome because it has huge ramifications. It's expensive when people fail to appear, et cetera. I mean, it's frustrating, it causes problems. New criminal activity is a public safety issue. New violent criminal activity is a real serious public safety issue as well. So we're looking at these outcomes during the pretrial period only. So, and this is another item, just to make sure, speaking of vocabulary, to make sure that we're all on the same page, and this is something that, that I sometimes get a little bit of pushback on. If we have person A, who we've classified, we said, all right, we've done our risk assessment on this person, and that person is low risk, and that means they have a 10% likelihood of failing to appear if we release them pretrial. Now, it's always important to remember, and this may seem like a no-brainer, but it's a really important distinction, and that is to mean we are calling that person low risk, but what that person means is that actuarially, statistically, they belong to a group of people. They belong to a group of people that have a 10% likelihood, right? So it's important to, and I always remind people of this, and it may seem like a matter of semantics, but it's important to look not at the individual and to say this person has a 10% likelihood, but rather to say this person belongs to a group that the research has shown has a 10% likelihood of failing to appear. Conversely, person B, we're calling that person high risk. What does that mean? That means they have a 60% likelihood of failing to appear if released. And again, that doesn't mean that they individually do. That means that they belong to a group of people. And when we look at that group, we can say, you know what? Some of them a good chunk of them are going to FTA, fail to appear, but some of them will not. And so even when we're talking about high-risk people, it's important to keep that in mind. And when we're talking about actuarially, I have 3 boys, aged 26 to 20, and they're all fantastic drivers, and I still pay for their car insurance, and I'll take a wild guess what my car insurance is like. They've never had an accident. They've had just what I would consider to be a normal amount of driving infractions in the totality of circumstances. But I pay out the nose for my insurance. Now, I don't write letters complaining. I take it on the chin. Because why? Because the evidence is on the insurance company's side, right? Young men who drive get in accidents and drive drunk and hurt people and things more often than similarly situated young female adults. So that's another way to look at actuarial science. So how and why do low-risk defendants end up detained? Well, there's a few reasons. There's, of course, the nature of the offense, right? Even people who are truly and actuarially, I'm not talking about people that are false negatives. I'm talking about people that are truly and actuarially low risk. Those people sometimes commit high-profile crimes. In the Kansas City area, some years ago, we had a very high-profile case, and you may have even heard of it. It was in the national news for some time. We had a pharmacist, I believe his last name was Courtney, and he got busted diluting chemotherapy drugs. For years, he was doing this, and he was doing it for profit, for personal gain. I don't know the specific nuances of his scheme, but he was making money, I guess, off of stretching drugs and whatever. And I mean, there's no telling. There is no telling the kind of damage that he caused, death, if not premature, that he may have caused. And however, when we look at this former pharmacist, actuarially, he's at low risk of ever doing anything like that ever again. All right, he's educated, he's employed, although his main credential was revoked, of course, and he's got a family that to this day surrounds him and says he's a great guy and he made a bad mistake, but he's a good person, etc. He's probably a great risk in the community, But he had a hard time, meaning, when I say great risk, I mean he has a low risk of FTA and a low risk of any further criminal activity. But he was detained. He was detained for a really long time and had a hard time making bail because of his high-profile case. So that's just one reason how a low-risk individual can be detained. Another reason, as we've already heard, an amount of bail is assigned that is unattainable. Bail is set too high, but that wasn't set too high, but it's yet unattainable for some reason. One of my favorite things to do is to work with groups of stakeholders that have undertaken pretrial reform, especially when there are members of the bench serving in that stakeholders group, people who set bail on a routine basis. Because when we take, almost without fail, when we take a really close look at who's sitting in jail, I have almost universally had at least one and many times more experiences where when we're looking at the list of folks that are still sitting in jail and the judges who made those decisions about setting that bail are also in that room, and they more often than not, one or more of them will say, "Why is David Singer still in jail? I adjusted his bail. It's who can't come up with $1,000?" Well, apparently David Singer can't come up with $1,000 because he's still cooling his heels in jail, even though, and it's just surprising. I don't want to necessarily harp on that, but it's interesting to me because what that means is that these judges are providing, and granted, it's anecdotal, it's not empirical, it's anecdotal evidence, but it's valid anecdotal evidence. They're essentially providing information that says, I intended for that person to get out. I intended for that person to get out, and they're still in the jail. There's also, when it comes to bail, no matter what level of bail has been set, there's also the reason low-risk people stay in jail sometimes is because they have a lack of social support, or they don't want to utilize their social support. They don't want their parents to know that they have a DUI. They don't want their family's help, or perhaps they are estranged from their family. There's a data set called the SCIPS data, the State Court Pretrial Services data set that's used. It's in the public domain, and it's used quite a bit to generate statistics like these. And so that's where these data came from. But look at this. Look at these items. In 1990, when we use these data from the 75 largest urban counties in the United States, so in other words, a really representative sample, when we take information from the 75 largest urban counties in the U.S. in 1990, of all felony defendants who were released, 42% of them were released on ROR, 25% were released on a surety bond of some kind. That's 1990. 16 years later, those numbers literally flip. In 2006, 75 largest urban counties of all felony defendants who were released from jail, 25% were released OR, 43% were released on surety bond of some kind, and there is absolutely no reason to believe in any substantive changes in this defendant population or general population that would warrant this change, right? The levels of drug use certainly fluctuate over time. The types of drugs that are used fluctuate over time. Unemployment, recession fluctuates over time, right? And so what's the reason? Why is that? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. One of the first things that comes to my mind is, as Justice Daniels mentioned earlier, and as I ran for the Kansas State House in 2006 as a Democrat, don't know what I was thinking, but so I was soundly beaten, but I knew and I learned even at that point, that concerns about public safety sell. Being tough on crime sells and works. Being tough, I mean, who can't garner more public support when they stand up and say things like, "We need to be tougher on violent criminals. We need to be tougher on this," and that's neither here nor there. But the problem is, hearkening back to the hammer analogy that we heard earlier as well. If get tough works for that, then get tough must work for here, and get tough works over here. And so we end up with a system that becomes stickier. We end up with a system that becomes more stigmatizing. We end up with a system that continues, causing harm, unintended harm. Why is David Singer still in jail? I thought for sure he would get out. When we look at secure facilities, specifically prisons and jails, those are, without question, our most expensive justice response. We need them. We will likely always need them. But we need to ask ourselves, what's the smartest way to use these facilities, both in terms of the literal costs, in terms of the social costs, and in terms of the costs to justice. When we look at the literal cost of jail incarceration, first of all, about more than actually 61% of the jail population is in a pretrial / unconvicted state. And that number has remained pretty stable over time. Right? The Bureau of Justice Statistics compiles this information, and when you look at the last 14 years, 15 years, it's like 60, 61, 62, 61, 60, 60, it just bounces right around that 60% mark. When we look at our jail populations, darn near 2/3, or well over half, are in a pretrial unconvicted status. Costing, on average, $60 a day. When we look at urban and suburban jurisdictions, the cost is even more. $100 is pretty typical, $100 a day. Some estimates are as high as $200 a day, and it's not uncommon for jails, especially jails in urban areas, to have fairly elaborate intake procedures where assessments are done, and mental health assessments, and risk assessments, and psychometric scales of all kinds, and all that costs money. So in light of these fiscal constraints, some questions we need to consider. What savings could we realize? Savings. I have yet to be in a jurisdiction over the last 5-10 years where I haven't heard budget constraints being a major problem. Any government-funded entity is having problems. As a member of a university community, I can attest to, we've been asked to cut $24 million of our budget again, and it's never gone up since I've been there in 1999. So we need to ask ourselves, what savings could be realized if some portion of the pretrial pot could be left in the community? Right? Instead of $60 a day to house, take care of, and treat that person, leaving them in the community, even supervising them in the community is about $3 a day. What portion could be released? How can we determine who's the best and the worst bet? And for those who are released, who aren't necessarily low risk, what do we have in the community to mitigate risk? And here we're talking about accountability measures and supervision and things of that nature. We also have to ask ourselves, if we're talking about leaving more people or allowing more people to remain in the community, what are the potential costs to public safety, and how do we navigate this politically? So we're looking at an average of $60 a day. We're looking at roughly 62%, that's a very broad figure, summary figure, of jail population is unconvicted, meaning they're legally not guilty. And of that 62%, perhaps half or more would probably be, these are estimates from a handful of studies, more than at least half, if not more, of that 62% would be actuarially assessed as low risk for failure to appear, for new criminal activity, and for new violent criminal activity using objective criteria. So, if they can be managed in the community, why aren't they? What role does money play in this? And what savings could be realized if the right resources were put towards the right effort? But one of the things I wanted to make sure was emphasized this morning was, aside from the literal costs, it's one thing to spend money, right? Because we know jail costs. Like, there's no surprises in that figure. Jail costs money, secure facilities cost money. What about other costs, sometimes termed hidden costs? Well, first of all, there's the presumption of innocence, so there's a potential cost to justice. Another hidden cost that is rarely measured empirically is the defendant has difficulty accessing counsel. The defendant has difficulty contributing to their defense in other ways. Difficult access to mental health and other assistance. It's, I'm sure, no surprise to the folks in this room the extent to which mental health issues within jails are being looked at, and research and reform is being undertaken in order to fully understand that rubric. From my hometown in Overland Park, Kansas, I now live in Kansas City, Missouri, but I used to live across the state line on the Kansas side. And the sheriff used to say as often as he could, he goes, I run the largest mental health facility in this state. And he knew that based on assessments that he had done demonstrating that the folks that were in the jail had active mental health issues. Well, it's hard to access mental health services while you're in jail. And the defendant experiences, and this is a kind of a key word going from this point forward, disruption. Disruption that may lead to continual involvement in the criminal justice system. And so the studies that we're going to look at in a little bit are asking the question, could pretrial decision-making contribute to the revolving door of the criminal justice system and corrections in particular? So let's look at some of this potential disruption. When we look at the disruption, which is going to serve as the reason why, maybe for folks who need to be convinced as to why this is really important work, job and employment, residential stability, custody of dependent children or care for a dependent adult, social network and positive support, financial disruption, both direct and indirect, and needed services aren't received, including health and mental health. And these are just some. These are sort of the lowest hanging fruit or the largest targets when we look at some of the disruption. Recently, a research brief was published that I authored last year that was published by the Crime and Justice Institute in Boston. And the purpose of this study was to compare people who spent less than 3 days in jail pretrial to those who spent 3 days or more. And we found that those who spent 3 or more days in jail increased the likelihood of unemployment, increased the likelihood of residential disruption, increase the likelihood of concern regarding their ability to maintain custody and or support dependent children, and increase the likelihood of financial disabilities. And these results controlled for the effects of demographics. These results controlled for actuarial risk level. The jurisdiction where these data came from uses an actuarial risk assessment that has been validated. I do want to point out that these results were based on self-reported information via a survey. This particular jurisdiction has a bond supervision unit. So people who are released pretrial often are assigned to bond supervision, which functions much like probation. It's probationary supervision, although the duration in most cases is much shorter than a sentence to probation. And for a period of time, in fact they still are, for a period of time they asked folks who come in for their first meeting with their bond supervision officer to fill out a survey that asked all the questions from which these data came. What's nice and interesting, though, is that we were able to ascertain whether or not they were employed before they had been arrested. So even when we controlled for that, even when we controlled for whether or not they had a job before they were arrested, the deleterious effects on employment after release were still seen. Some of the newest research, when we look at the effect of pretrial detention, involves what I call a more granular and in-depth investigation into the effects of detention. In other words, investigating the extent to which money bail, which frankly has traditionally been used as a proxy for risk or dangerousness, and Justice Daniels illuminated that very well, right? Serious crime, high bail. Not so serious crime, lesser bail. But it doesn't work as often as we'd like, and it doesn't work in the ways that we anticipate that it should. So, and we're also, in addition to looking at a more granular analysis of the effect of pretrial detention, we're also looking at what I call the three usual suspects when it comes to pretrial research: failure to appear. Can we predict failure to appear? Can we predict new criminal activity? Can we predict new violent criminal activity or the propensity thereof? But the newest research looks at another acronym, PD, NCA, which stands for post-dispositional new criminal activity and charges. So in other words, what if we were able to create a controlled study that controlled for all the potential influencers of everything that comes after the pretrial phase? Does pretrial detention have an effect on the likelihood that someone will engage in more additional criminal activity or become charged with additional criminal activity after disposition for the current case? And that's really interesting, because then you're looking at basically the extent to which pretrial detention, when we're locking up the wrong folks and not releasing the right folks, may actually increase recidivism. I mentioned the Arnold Foundation, looking at this particular study, the hidden cost, referred to as the hidden cost study. We found a relationship between days in jail pretrial and a lot of negative outcomes. The relationship appeared for post-disposition new criminal activity, and this may provide evidence of what I refer to as persistent disruption, many months and even years down the road, perpetuating system involvement, even or perhaps especially for low-risk individuals. And this study was replicated in one jurisdiction 3 days later and found largely the same things. Found a strong relationship between days spent in jail pretrial and failure to appear, but not for NCA, but did find it for new post-dispositional new criminal activity at the 12-month period. So when we look at the length of pretrial detention and whether or not it's related to the likelihood of pretrial FTA once we've controlled for other things, we found that defendants who spent 2 to 3 days in jail were significantly more likely to FTA than those who spent 1 day. All right? And think about that. 2 to 3 days versus 1 day. Right? That person, I'm going to guess that for most jurisdictions in Connecticut, the pretrial period lasts longer than 3 days. Right? That case typically doesn't resolve. Maybe a handful of them do, but not all of them. If we're going to let them out after 3, why don't we let them out after 1? Especially when we see things like this, and especially, and this comes out later on, especially if the person is likely going to be convicted of an offense that, if convicted, holds the likelihood of community sanction. In other words, if we're going to leave them in the community later on, why not put them in the community now? All we're doing, and now we have evidence that says, you know what, we might actually be increasing their dangerousness by doing that, by holding them longer than is necessary. Now, I should also add that defendants who spent 31 or more days were significantly less likely to fail to appear, but that makes intuitive sense because that means essentially that they are in jail for a goodly chunk of, if not all of, the pretrial period. So if you, and this to me, this particular point harkens back to the whole thing of, you know, if you would like a 100% appearance rate, then just we need to jail everybody, and that's all we need to do. And these results controlled for, and that you're going to see this a lot, so I won't read this but one time, because all of these results controlled for age of the defendant, gender, race, ethnicity, marital status, actuarial risk level, their supervision status, in other words, whether or not they were supervised on pretrial supervision or not, their offense type, the offense level, and time at risk, which was pretty much everything that we had available that could possibly relate to these outcomes. And these results held true with some variation for several subgroups. So in other words, once we identified this global finding of 2 to 3 days in jail versus 1, right, controlling for all those things, we then isolated that statistical model for whites, blacks, males, females, felony, people charged with the felony, people charged with the misdemeanor, and risk level, focusing on low and moderate, and found the same thing. To varying degrees, different magnitude, but the same effect. It never reversed and it never went away. So in sum, the likelihood of FTA significantly increased to varying degrees. It increased 9% overall and 12 to 26% depending on defendant characteristics when spending 2 to 3 days in jail compared to 1 or less. What about the length of pretrial detention related to the likelihood of NCA once these other items, statistical controls, are considered? Overall, the probability, the likelihood of new criminal activity increased significantly for each length of time used, 2 to 3, 4 to 7, 8 to 14, 15 to 30, and 31 plus, increasing the likelihood of new criminal activity between 15% and 41%. It was a linear relationship. Linear meaning with each increase in the amount of time spent pre-trial, there was a significant increase in the likelihood of new criminal activity. And these controlled for all the previous controls mentioned as well. And these results also held true for all subgroups that we looked at. The likelihood of NCA significantly and substantially increased for defendants who spent 2 or more days in jail when compared to 1 day or less. So again, especially when we look at the folks that are spending time in jail that are being held for 5 days or 7 days or 9 days, but are then being released and then have a length of time in the community after they've been released, it would behoove us, at least based on these results, it would behoove us to see if there's some possible way we can get them out before that amount of time. Is pretrial detention related to new criminal activity post-disposition? So here's that recidivism outcome that I mentioned earlier. The likelihood of new criminal activity after the case was resolved at 12 months post-disposition, there was a 30% increase in the likelihood. And at the 24-month, there was another 29% increase in the likelihood. And these controlled for all the same controls as mentioned before. And we also isolated subgroups of defendants and found the same effect for all those subgroups of defendants as well. Again, with varying degrees of magnitude, but always statistically significant, which basically is all that means is that the relationship that was observed is unlikely to be spurious. It's unlikely to be the result of chance. And same thing for 24 months. So in sum, being detained pre-trial any length of time was associated with significant and substantial increases in the likelihood of post-disposition new criminal activity at both the 12-month and 24-month. What about the length of pre-trial detention? We looked at that as well. The likelihood of NCA post-disposition increased significantly for each category of time spent in jail, except for 31 or more days for both the 12 and 24-month follow-up period, controlling for all this, all those same items. And the likelihood was ranged between 15 and 41% at the 12-month and between 16 and 42% for the 24-month. So in some, the likelihood of post-disposition NCA increased significantly for the length of time spent in jail. So what does all this mean? Why did it happen? Well, it's important to remember about something I mentioned earlier, and that's the power of statistical control. Many factors that are correlated with these outcomes were controlled for, and we made efforts at every turn to isolate the effects of pretrial detention, yes or no, as well as the effects of the length of time spent in jail pretrial, to isolate those effects so we could do, as I mentioned earlier, a very granular analysis. And there's this word again, the destabilization. The destabilization that occurs due to pretrial detention has both immediate effects, job interference or job loss, financial difficulty, broken bonds, medication interruption, residential instability, child welfare, FTA and NCA per the immediate case, as well as long-term effects because of a higher likelihood of prolonged criminal activity. And the revolving door continues, and the pretrial detention may contribute to the stickiness of the justice system. What about pretrial detention's effect on sentencing outcomes? Well, we looked at that as well. Is pretrial detention, meaning detained for the entire pretrial period, related to the length of jail incarceration that is ordered at sentencing for misdemeanor offendants? It was. Those that were detained for the entire pretrial period received a jail sentence that was 2.78 times longer, which was a statistically significant increase, than sentences received by defendants who were released at some point. We controlled for all the same factors, and we found the same effects to varying degrees for subgroups. So when we look at pretrial detention and pretrial outcomes, we can't detain everybody, right? It's not practical, it's not ethical, and it costs a lot of money. We should detain some people, those that may pose the highest risk. Just some pretrial detention, in other words, not the whole time, can increase the likelihood of FTA and NCA. And the majority of people upon conviction end up in a community-based sanction like probation anyway. And that really, that last point is one that I really have been trying to emphasize as much as I can whenever I get a chance. That is, the majority of people that are convicted end up in a community-based sanction anyway. So we're going to put them in the community anyway. So why would we hold them in jail any longer than we have to, knowing that doing so is going to have some of these deleterious effects? So what's going on when someone is detained pretrial? So we took a look at quote-unquote big data, to use a common term today. How might this revolving door continue? If you've ever heard this phrased on here, or those of you that sit on the bench that have seen the same people come before you many times, I wonder if you've ever thought to yourself, this person, they're not getting worse, but they're not getting better. In other words, they sort of have this perpetual chaos going on in their lives. And I use the term chaos. It's kind of a charged term, but we all know what it is. It's difficulty maintaining healthy relationships, lack of credentials, many obligations that they have a hard time staying on top of, substance use, etc. Those are the folks that we may, if we were able to target them appropriately with the right services, we may be able to keep them out of jail and keep them out of jail for long periods of time. So we look at pretrial detention, even short-term stays, having this destabilization effect, right? It may exacerbate already tenuous situations. When we think about what are the hallmarks of a functional adult, when I look at my 3 adult boys, I'm like, how do I know that they're doing okay? How do I know that they are a functional, stable adult? Well, they're self-sustaining. They have a stable residential situation. They're able to fulfill their appropriate roles for dependent children, although thankfully I'm not a grandfather yet. I'm hoping to make it to 50 before that happens. But that they're meeting their obligations and that they have financial stability and that they're refraining from criminal activity. I mean, these are the hallmarks of a functional adult. So how might pretrial detention increase the likelihood of FTA and NCA? Well, even short stays runs the risk of creating destabilization. There's job loss, loss of residence, destabilization of familial relationships, loss of income. Even a high-functioning individual with resources who ends up detained might have problems in one or more of these aforementioned areas if detained pretrial. I'm a full professor at a state university. I've had tenure for 11 years. So, you know, if you believe the popular media, I have pretty decent job security. And I do. I'm not going to stand up here and say that I don't. By the same token, if I disappeared into a jail cell for 5 to 10 days, I'd have some serious problems. And if it happened a second time, I'd be bounced. They would bounce me. I have absolutely no doubt. So think about that when you think about the person who is not a tenured professor or a long-standing member of the bar, for example. Think about the person who's working full-time in the fast food industry. In other words, they're highly replaceable. Who have custody of school-aged children. Who are sharing an apartment with a friend and their name's not on the lease. Who's living check to check. What would happen to all of those domains if they had to spend 5 days in jail? Or maybe even just 24 hours. Add to this hypothetical adult minor mental health needs, or major mental health needs for that matter. Perhaps some substance abuse, other needs. In short, when we take someone who is functional, but on or near the edge, if you will, it doesn't take much to put them in a spiral where small needs become big ones, where functionality is severely compromised, where the job is lost, where the children are lost, where the living situation where they were already one argument away from being on the street are now on the street, where they weren't getting mental health needs met, and now they're especially not getting their mental health needs met. It doesn't take much to tip them over into like I said, a spiral. And this is a disruption that leads on the individual level to increase the likelihood of failure to appear or new criminal activity. And this is the disruption that may make the criminal justice system stickier and contribute to the revolving door. So I think what I'm going to do is leave it at that because I want to be, in the interest of being transparent, the rest of this presentation, which you are welcome to digitally if you would like, it's also in a ridiculously small fonted handout on your table as well. That's on me. That is on me. But my email address is on both is on the PowerPoint. I'm also not that difficult to find. I would welcome your questions, and in fact, I think we have a few minutes where I can entertain a couple questions. I do want to mention, though, really the rest of the presentation I have is information on pretrial risk assessment and the benefits thereof, which is something that, to be frank with you, which is something you already know, the state of Connecticut is far ahead compared to many jurisdictions. Now, one of the reasons, Alex, I keep losing. One of the reasons I'd like to take a look at some of the original research, if it's available, is because I'm always of a mind that even if something is working and even if something's working well, there may be ways in which some improvements can be made, and I'm happy to provide some recommendations in that regard as well. My point simply being the rest of my presentation, which I wanted to include because pretrial risk assessment, actuarial assessment is such an important piece of this puzzle. That really should be used to drive reform is what's contained in there. And the state of Connecticut, you're already there, as it were. So anyway, on that note, I will quiet down and entertain a question or two, if I may.
You talked about the destabilization of a short period of incarceration, but you haven't addressed the issue that comes up frequently about the person who's unstable when they go in because they're intoxicated or because they're high on drugs or because they have mental health issues. And the stabilization that can be given to them by holding them for a short period of time to detox or to get them restored to proper drug treatment for mental health issues.
So in terms of, meaning a stay in jail might increase the stabilization for somebody who's intoxicated and needs to become sober?
Right, or somebody who's high on drugs and needs to be detoxed, or someone who's mentally ill, who's off their medications, and you can get them back on the medications in a few days. If you have jail facilities that are able to successfully do that, that's able to successfully and safely shepherd someone through
detoxification, which I would hope also leads to at least the offering of services to help with that substance abuse issue, or a jail facility that is able to either diagnose an existing serious mental health issue and or obtain medications and whatnot. And that may be the case. And so, yes, I would completely agree with you on that count. But most of the places that I visit and work with, the jails are not equipped to do those things, or at least not do them very well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I have a question about the risk assessment, if that's all right.
Sure.
So you made a pretty compelling case for the way in which a short pretrial detention can have significant impacts on a poor person's criminal history. The length of incarceration that they might receive, the number of convictions that they might have by virtue of being disadvantaged and held pretrial. We also know that people of color are policed differently, that there are disparate impacts on sentencing, on charging recommendations, and on conviction rates. So how do these risk assessment tools account for the fact that they're using data that's already based on all of these disparities?
You've hit on, okay. That's a wonderful, thank you very much for that. That's a wonderful question. And what makes it so wonderful is because it acknowledges that we're a long way from achieving objectivity in criminal justice decision making. And some of you may have been aware that like risk assessment has really been under the microscope ever since Attorney General Holder shone the light and said, are we sure we want to go this route? And what he was referring primarily to is the use of actuarial risk assessment at the sentencing stage, which is still being hotly debated. All right, now, risk assessments from days of yore were terrible. I mean, there are examples of risk assessments that literally use items like sex and race to assign different points of risk. Now, thankfully, those haven't been in use, or they're not in use nearly to the extent that they have been. And so the call came out, or the call went out to say, we need objective measures. Forget all those, don't use any items on your risk assessment that even remotely smack of demographics. In fact, don't even use things like education and employment, even residential stability, because those three things, which by the way are very common in many risk assessments today, opportunity for employment, opportunity for education, is not equally attainable across communities and across subpopulations, to use clinical sterile terms. And so they said, let's just use criminal history factors. And I have so far not gotten a lot of traction, but my response has been, and you think just using criminal history factors, given everything you cited and many other things, differential law enforcement, all of the things, is going to fix bias in the system? No, it's not. It's not. We don't have much better at this point in time, unless we wanted to go a completely different route, and that would be like a psychometric scale that's done via an interview on an individual basis with a professional who's been trained, who does not hold personal biases and things of that nature. That's a route you can go, but no one's going to do that because no one's got the time. First of all, no one's going to put the resources to develop that kind of thing or use one that exists. Plus, the case flow at the pretrial phase is so fast. That's something we didn't get to, but the case flow is so high, and the need to make decisions quickly is so important that can't be done. Now, that sounds sad, but I do think that we've moved in the right direction, but I will not stand up here and say that even the most objective actuarial risk assessments don't contain the potential for bias just based on their construction alone.
Two quick comments. One, you mentioned the length of pretrial detention was correlated to new criminal conduct except for 31 plus days. So does that mean the 31 plus days does not have any effect or actually has the reverse effect?
Not the reverse effect, but it had no effect. In other words, when we isolated that group of folks, people who were detained pretrial 31 days or more, they had a likelihood of new criminal activity, but it wasn't significantly above the length of time that was just below them.
And so a couple other things that came to mind when you listed that list of what happens or the likelihood of incarceration at the end. You said you did control for that, because I've, many times a judge is making a determination on the case. They see the seriousness of the offense, the facts as the state puts it on, and I think they're making a decision. Is this going to end up in jail? Is this going to end up a jail case or not? And I think the bond is affected by that. But what you're saying, that you've controlled for that, and in similar situations, Johnny gets no bond, same type of charges, this person gets a bond, and that person's getting more jail time than this person.
Yeah, exactly. And the person that got the more jail time had a higher likelihood of those negative outcomes.
And then finally, you bring up the 1 to 2 days. What highlights to me is how important it is to get these services or to get this process done up front and quickly.
Yes.
We have programs in the state that it's utilized, called the GRI program or other programs, but many times to even get them evaluated, and then some sort of treatment plan to even convince a judge, hey judge, can this person be deferred and not sit in jail, may take many months.
I know.
So we're way beyond the 2 to 3 days.
Yeah, and that's the importance. I'd harken back to what Justice Daniel shared earlier about the importance of a stakeholder group, people who are representative of the whole system, who have the wherewithal and who understand the entirety of the problem as best they can as a body, and who also are willing to examine the system and look for areas in which we could possibly speed things up. Like I'm working with Salina County literally in the middle of Kansas, and they found just one area. And it's almost like a matter of like, okay, if we could just get an intern who's willing to take these papers and bring them over here, like across town, we can cut case processing by days. I mean, it's stuff like that. Now, not everything is low-hanging fruit like that, but that change came about by a group of people, a group of stakeholders with intention, coming forth and looking at the system and making those recommendations. So, thank you all very much. This was such a pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.